brings me to our first and keynote speaker, Diana Pound. Diana studied at University of East Anglia and then did the Landscape Ecology Masters at Y College. She's passionate about helping people find solutions that work for them, for nature and for climate. And in 2000, she set up Dialogue Matters, which is a specialist consultancy in stakeholder dialogue, training and facilitation, bringing people together from different backgrounds and interests to share understanding, explore ideas and plan actions. She's worked in 28 countries, advised organizations, governments, international bodies on best practice, and her and Dialogue Matters have received many awards for their work, including CIEEM's prestigious Tony Bradshaw Award and other best practice awards. And Diana in 2019 was awarded IUCN's Commission on Education and Communication Award for Excellence for Western Europe. So Diana, over to you to seize the moment.
Great, thanks. So I'll just share my screen. And I'll need somebody to tell me whether I've got it on the right, whether you're seeing the presentation view or not. So which one are you seeing, the presenter's view or are you seeing my view or the main view? Somebody tell me.
Hi Diana, yeah, we can see the main view, so it's in full screen.
Excellent, excellent. So I will get underway. So really chuffed and delighted to be presenting to you this morning. And I'm talking about seizing the moment and getting fresh momentum. And this presentation is going to go at some pace. I was tasked with talking about the ongoing and interlinked biodiversity crisis and climate emergency, our role as individuals, breaking down barriers and building momentum. And frankly, that just feels to me like everything. So I've constrained myself to 30 minutes and we'll get started immediately. So I've put some of my sort of exhortations for change. I've put them on the screen because some people absorb information better by reading than hearing my voice, and some by hearing my voice. But I honestly and passionately feel that if we as environmental professionals do not seize this moment with every jot of our courage and wisdom and imagination and determination, then future generations are not going to have a habitable planet. And we have to do our utmost to bring about this vital transformation on which all of life, not just our own human life, but all life depends.
Sorry, Diana.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you mind moving the mic a bit closer? You're a little bit faint.
Is that better? It's really right on my mouth. Is that better now?
Yes, I think so. Okay,
I'm not quite sure why. It was all perfect last week. Okay, so the nature and climate crisis is in my view, part of the same thing. It's all about our overexploitation of the planet's ability to cope with what we take from it or give to it. And tackling either without the other, I think, is really flawed. But tackling both together in some technical way, I think, is also flawed because there is so much more to consider, and that's part of what I'm going to talk about. And I think the environmental world has been incredibly good at looking out to everybody else and talking about how they need to change and how their practices need to change. I think we're maybe not so good sometimes at reflecting on how we ourselves need to change. So I think we really need to look at what works and accelerate, amplify and scale that, and then take an honest look at some of what we've been doing that's outdated and that has actually been causing the very barriers that we want to break down. So I'm going to talk about reasons to be hopeful, overcoming barriers to motivate others, motivate ourselves, motivate others, understand the climate and nature crisis in a more integrated way, sharing power, and I've got calls to action scattered throughout. So reasons to be hopeful, well, I've got some quotes as well. So this was from Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum. The pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine and reset our world. And I was going to be at some of the big global events this year about biodiversity and climate, and they've all been postponed. And that felt deeply frustrating and almost slightly catastrophic when that happened. But actually now I think maybe this reimagining and resetting has done us an enormous favour. And I've quoted myself here, which is a bit of a weird thing to do in a PowerPoint presentation, but this is my answer over 40 years of my professional career. When people have said, why do you do what you do? What's that about? And this is my answer, that my life's aim has been, and will continue to be, to keep things as good as possible, to play my part, to keep things as good as possible for as long as possible, and I hope the world will wake up. And I think that last year it did. So I'm going to talk a little bit about social tipping points. We're probably more familiar with ecological or environmental tipping points, but social systems can tip as well. And research is a bit light on this, but it suggests that about 25% of a group thinking or doing differently is enough to tip the group. So in that case, what of concern for climate and nature? How close to 25% are we? Well, it's actually extraordinarily good news. So these were two surveys that have come up in the last couple of months. So one was done in January and February, and it was across the world. 80,000 people were surveyed, and 97% think climate change is serious. 70 of those think it's very serious. And in some countries, actually it's 85 to 90 think it's very serious, and that includes places like Kenya and China, and some countries that you maybe wouldn't have anticipated would have been in that category. Then in the middle of the pandemic, so I think this is even more compelling. So I've got a cat now coming onto my lap. Sorry, go away. Right. In the middle of the pandemic, Futera did a survey of people in the US and the UK and found 77% of people believe we should make as many lifestyle changes to stop climate change as we're making to stop COVID. Now, I find that profoundly encouraging. And 88% believe the lifestyle change needed will improve their quality of life or make no difference. Well, for most of my professional life, I've heard people saying, being green is going to disadvantage my quality of life. I don't want to do it. It's about something less than I have now. Well, if 88% are now believing it will improve or make no difference, we have tipped into something very different in the way that people perceive the environment. We've also got new and unexpected allies. In preparing for this, I was actually overwhelmed with the amount of signs I was seeing of different sectors coming out saying we've got to have a green recovery. So top business leaders, 200 CEOs called for a clean and just recovery. And that was not the usual suspects. That wasn't just the companies that you think are greener anyway. It included some odd ones like, I don't know, the National Grid and Heathrow Airport and HSBC, so and I think even BP were in there, which puzzled me a little bit. There we go, that's great. And then in the middle of their own freefall, UK arts leaders a month ago put out a call that we must have a green recovery, seeing the crisis as the biggest threat to the existence. And I just think this is extraordinary that when they've got so much else they would want to be shouting about, they're shouting about a need for a green recovery. Then a couple of weeks back, I like to visit other sectors and hear what they're thinking about. And I went to an event, an international event, with corporate and banking leads, having a talk about whether we're going to shift from shareholder to stakeholder capitalism. And there were significant shifts in America last year with a shift towards stakeholder capitalism. The difference is shareholder is about you want the business to do good so you get a bit of money out of it. And stakeholder capitalism is you want the business to thrive over the long term, you want it to work for you for sure, but also for the people who work for it, its supply chains and the communities around it. And were we going to make this shift to responsible capitalism or not? And what had COVID done around that? And frankly, if I hadn't known that I was not with a bunch of environmentalists, I would have thought I was, because all the talks about environment, society, and governance, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the need for ethical consumption and for brand allegiance around ethical consumption, and their conclusion is that we are shifting towards stakeholder capitalism, responsible capitalism. So banking world's on the move. The case has been made, so this report on the left, the economic case has been made that a green recovery is going to repair the global economy, create more jobs, greater return on investment short-term and long-term cost savings, all more than conventional stimulus. So the economic case has been made. Political expediency, hard to believe given what's going on in America and here, but we mustn't be so narrowly focused. There's the rest of the world to think about too. And the World WHO came out with this statistic that half of the world's total GDP is moderate to severe risk from nature loss. But now helping people on the planet have become the same thing. And that's really compelling and attractive idea for political leaders, or many of them. Last week or the week before, I can't quite remember when, but the EU, US, China and India, whatever you're seeing in the political news, they joined together to start formulating plans for a green recovery under the initiative of the International Energy Agency. And the Overton window is, the political commentators are saying the Overton window is opening up. Now, the Overton window is the space within which ideas can be talked about politically and expect to get some traction with the voters. So policy ideas that once were dismissed out of hand are now being widely discussed, and the Green New Deal and green recovery is right in there. And, you know, 2 years ago, it wouldn't have made it into the window. And regardless of what's going on around all of those different facets of human life, the markets themselves are speaking. So the pace and price for renewables has changed so rapidly that the financial world's in a bit of a panic, seeing the potential for $100 trillion worth of fossil fuel assets to be stranded. And pre-pandemic, the prediction was that there'd be a collapse of the fossil fuel markets by 2028. And people are now saying they think it will be sooner. Well, I don't know whether they're right or not. This is not my sphere, obviously, but I'm excited to hear that kind of thinking. And the divestment movement is accelerating at pace. And I think we're going to hear a big announcement in about 2 weeks' time from the backstories I'm hearing of a number of global leaders of religious movements and other world leaders talking about divestment and pushing that forward even harder. And leaving aside the markets, there's things going on where we're kind of at the end of an era. So we're at this crossing point between economic paradigms, the fossil fuel paradigm, and something new and different. Some people call it the third industrial revolution. And apparently when we cross these big changes, it takes 3 things to converge. A change in communication tech. So we've shifted obviously the last 20 years or so from paper to the internet. A change in energy, which is happening even faster from renewables, from fossil fuels to renewable and battery, and a change in mobility and logistics, and that's how things get around, how knowledge gets around, how things get around. And we're moving to the sharing economy, artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Things. And this time it's not just a convergence that these sort of innovation points are all sort of coalescing at about the same time. It's integration, because it's all happening through the digital revolution. And so this shift to the next industrial revolution was sort of at the starting blocks, and now COVID has fired the gun. And people think the acceleration of change across all these things is now going to go even faster. So that, I hope, was some thoughts that might give you some hope that things are not all lost, but there's reasons to hope. But actually, I want to talk about overcoming barriers to motivating ourselves from loss to stubborn optimism. So which of these inspires you more? Is it that the year is 2050, the world is on fire, the air is suffocating and deadly and entire countries are underwater? Or is it the year is 2050, the world's breathing, the air is fresh, nature is thriving and entire populations have better quality of life? Christy, if you're able to share the poll really quickly, but if not, just let me know and I'll press on.
Yes, no problem. I'll launch the poll now for you.
Thank you.
There we go. Everyone should be able to see the poll on their screens, and I'll give you a few seconds to make your choice. Okay, and I'll stop the poll there and share the results. So hopefully you can see the results there, Diana. I
can, and that's great, and pretty much what I expected. So the research suggests around what it motivates us, that a minority, as we can see here, can be motivated by fear and loss, but the majority are motivated by inspiration and positive stories. And it also suggests that those who are motivated by fear and loss, that can sustain you in the short term, but it doesn't sustain over the long term. So you might have moments of fear and loss, and that catalyze more motivation in the short term, but then what that does to you psychologically, it gradually dissipates, and then you'll need another shock or another fear. You'll need to keep sort of having to frighten and shock yourself to keep up the motivation. So I say be hopeful. And this comes from Christiana Figueira. And she's got, she was the UN Secretary for Climate Change between 2010 and 2016. And I've met her, she's an inspirational figure. I've done some work for the UN CCC convention. And here are some quotes from her book. Our individual boundaries are porous. We infect each other with ills and joys. So let's infect each other with stubborn optimism and determined action. A compelling vision is like a hook in the future. It connects you to pockets of possibility that are emerging and pulls them into present. To hold on to that. So I'm going to suggest that you just take a quick moment and think, what's your why? What motivates you? Because we need to understand our deep motivations for wanting to help the world be better than it otherwise would be. And for example, Ursula von der Leyen, who's EU president, when she talked to the Green New Deal, when she launched that, she sort of went off script slightly, and she said, towards the end, she talked to the next generation and said, with real force and passion, we are going to do this. So her motivation was about the next generation. For mine, that little lad on the left, he's the son of a friend of mine. I don't really know him, but I saw her picture and said, could I please share this picture? Because that encapsulates for me my drivers, the next generation, and the delight and treasuring of the beauties of nature. And that's all in that beautiful picture. So just take a moment. Why do you think this future is worth fighting for? Maybe just jot the first thing that comes to your mind down on a bit of paper. Okay, so I'm going to do these calls to action in our fluorescent green, which is part of our corporate colours, but it's a little bit lurid, I accept. So these are some thoughts about how you respond to that bit. So I think we have to accept that some of us are dealing with grief and loss. I certainly do a lot, eco-grief, but increase your resilience and hope. And we all know that 20 minutes in nature does us enormous good. So try and factor that into each day. Find out your why. Why are you motivated, just as I was talking about? Look for signs of hope and share them widely. Read brilliant books that will help you and inspire you. These are not avoiding the challenge that we're facing, but talk about hope. So Hope in Hell by Jonathan Porritt, which came out, I think, last week or the week before, and The Future We Choose by Christiana and her colleague Tom. Sign up to Global Optimism so that you hear some great news, and support high ambition, high impact projects. And I encourage you to check out ARC 2030. I'm a founder member, and it's probably the most ambitious thing I have ever seen, ever. So have a little look at that. Okay, so overcoming barriers to motivating others. So some more quotes. Green won't spread by guilt or fear. We need aspiration and desire. Creep subtly into people's hearts. That was Jane Goodall. And knowledge is overrated as a way to change behaviour. And that came from Savion Fowle at Plymouth. So we've been really rather good at the doom and gloom stories and the problems and difficulties and trying to motivate and challenge people through that, and it doesn't really work. So when we design and facilitate dialogue, we take a constructive approach. And that means instead of a problem solving approach, saying what's the problem, how do we fix it, we say what's working, how do we strengthen it, and what more do we need to do. And there was some research done, I think it was in the Indonesian forest, where they got a sets of communities who were broadly the same, and they divided them into two groups randomly. And one lot, they went and did problem solving processes with the communities and said about forest management, what were the problems of forest management, how did they need to fix it? And in the other, they did the asset-based thinking and said, okay, so what's working great around forest management, how could you do that more, and what else do you need to do? And this is a startling difference in what happened to the people. So people went from, the comparison is, frustration or motivated, feeling that anything you've already done around environment is not valued, or feeling it is valued, thinking environment is complex and difficult and it's a huge problem, or feeling that actually we've already identified these great things we're doing, the environment is looking after it, is doable, it's got many benefits, let's get on with it. Feeling overwhelmed to believing in your own capacity and agency to make a difference, risk averse to innovative, disowning to willing to get involved, and no momentum or resistance to change or momentum to delivery. So I've been arguing for about 15 years that as an environmental sector, we are always on the left-hand side, and we are causing people to have those reactions, which are blocking, overwhelmed, risk-averse, disowning, and we've got to start working on the right-hand side. We've got to start motivating these very different behaviours, and I'm not an idealistic nutter to be saying this. I've taken this approach on bovine TB in the badger cull. I've taken it in a collapsing fishery. I've taken it with my team in some really tough situations, and it still works. It still starts bringing motivation, can-do-ness, and positive change. So it's important to think, oh, what was actually going on around that? And I'm just going to dip into a little bit of psychology. And this comes from some psychological barriers to accepting and understanding climate change. And I flipped it into more positive things. So it's, if people have, we all, this is not them out there, this is all of us, human beings, have a natural bias to short-term and localism. Well, then we need to work with that as environmentalists. So let's focus on a long-term vision for sure. But then let's dig into the short-term actions that are in that group's gifts to get on with here and now and make a difference here and now in their space, in their locality, or in whatever sphere of governance they're working in. People desire autonomy and control, so telling people what to do and trying to compel them and force them just gets backlash and reaction, and we know that. We've experienced that. So let's work with stakeholders to generate ideas together as equals. People pursue happiness and avoid negative emotions, so people don't want to think about climate change or nature loss. So let's help groups focus on what they're doing well and how that strengthens and amplifies, and that speaks back to the previous slide. People are very driven to maintain self-esteem, and if you tell people that what they do, if you flight shame or whatever shame, and tell people that they're damaging nature and environment, that puts them in cognitive dissonance, and their brain will give them two choices. Either they're not a very good person, which damages their self-esteem, or they are a good person, which must mean you're wrong. And guess which their brain is going to persuade them is the right answer there. So ensure that anybody's good efforts are uncovered, recognised and acknowledged, and build on those. And there's a load of group psychology too. So people have a desire to be part of groups with a great reputation. So when we castigate farmers or fishers or hunters or developers or whoever it is we're castigating, that they are inevitably going to put up barriers against us. So let's work respectfully and appreciatively with others. To belong to a group, we create and defend our group norms. And if those norms are being anti-environment, then clearly that's not a norm we want to stimulate or cause. So let's engage opinion leaders and opinion formers who aren't necessarily the obvious leaders, but they're the people who influence groups, and create norms of support and action for nature and climate. When there's a change, groups and factions can polarize. So this is where most of my work is around consensus building and helping people negotiate to win-wins. And then people have this huge drive for justice, equity and fairness. So let's help groups through equitable good practice process. And there's lots of research around participation and so on now. And it shows that people will accept outcomes that are not their first preference if they believe that the process of dialogue and agreement was fair and legitimate and run well. So let's work with this grain of human nature. So with this understanding, we as professional environmentalists, we can avoid tramping around, which we've done over decades, catalysing the very resistance, denial, reactance, and barriers that have frustrated us like mad. And we've kind of blamed other people, but we need, I'm not absolving them of all responsibility, but I do say let's look at what we could do differently to not catalyse those things. Let's work with that grain of human nature. And if you want to give it a go, here's a, I was speaking before Christmas, and I had constructive climate change conversations for Christmas. I gave a little slide, and this is it doesn't have to be Christmas to do this, but try this pattern. So first of all, next time you're at a social event with a friend or family member, and somebody starts talking about environment, listen attentively and be curious, and invite them to tell you what they're doing well for nature and climate. And whatever they say, however small, affirm it. Then ask if there's any way they could do it more or complement it. Don't advise or instruct unless they ask. You're a professional environmentalist, can you help me? That's fine, but don't advise otherwise. Let them come to their own thoughts. Ask, do you think there's anything that would help make that easier? And what might the first steps be? And then whatever they say, encourage. And then watch people commit to doing far more for nature and climate than they would have done if you'd flight shame. I was speaking at Christmas to somebody who flies about 8 times a year to glorious sort of tourist destination. Now she's retired and rather wealthy, and I could have flight shamed her like crazy, but I didn't. And I found some good things she was doing around the environment, and she herself went on to say, maybe I've got to rethink this business of flying everywhere. Obviously that was pre-COVID, so that's been taken from her anyway, but for the time being. But it works, so just give it a go. So here's my action points from this. Let go of doom and gloom. It doesn't motivate most of us. or anybody else very much. And there's a link to some resources. I'm sorry they're not in black. I don't know why. When I dropped them in here, they went to this rather faint grey. Focus on the strengths and what's working well in a situation, not the problems and issues and difficulties. Let's start auditing and recognising, celebrating and fanfaring our successes. I've done so much work. I've gone to areas and said, you know, what's working well here? And they say, well, we don't know, but let's show you the stats of lost species or lost habitats, or loss is beautifully audited in glossy reports, but there is no auditing of the successful projects, of the gains that have been made. So let's apply great practice, cross-stage dialogue, of course I would say that, and find out more about the science of effective communication. And there's a resource there, the Framing Nature Toolkit, if you've not come across it. Okay, so now to overcoming barriers to understanding. So this is from reductionist linear thinking to collaborative systems thinking. And we've all been trained in linear thinking and reductionism, and it's sort of how people get their specialisms, and it's so embedded in research world, science world, and the way many of us will have earned our degrees. But it's really, really not very suitable for the context we're now in. It might have worked, you know, linear reductionist thinking might have worked years ago, but really we now have to shift to systems thinking, because climate and nature are part of the same thing. Climate is obviously provides the conditions in which nature and human life can flourish, and nature and human life alter the climate. So nature regulates it, and humans seem to be doing the opposite and damaging it. But they're all part of the same system. But that's a nice simple drawing, and of course life is nothing like that simple. So the context for action, any action, and this is again the sphere that I work in all the time, is that there's huge interdependencies, multiple complexities, loads of uncertainty, lots of controversy, and multiple perspectives. And this lovely image, which isn't mine, it comes from Kevin Collins from the Open University. I've got this slide back in 2004, and I use it a lot, because we've got this huge can of worms to try and sort out. But if frightened of the can of worms, we go back to reductionism, we end up with this. So we fixate on parts of the system and we miss the whole. So an elephant is like a brush, or it's like a rope. This is the 5 Blind Man and the Elephant. Apparently, I was in India doing some work for British Council last year, and they told me that this is a story, this is an Indian story. So the elephant's ears are too big, because that's an African elephant, not an Indian elephant. But anyway, an elephant is like a brush, or it's like a rope, or it's like a tree trunk. Or this poor chap is saying, actually, it's soft and mushy. So we end up with tiny fragmented views of what the world's really like, and we end up making mistakes. So we can act to produce short-term benefit at a long-term cost. The solution to one problem can cause another problem with unintended results, and I think we see that a lot. And so we need to go to systems thinking. Now, I can't in a minute or two explain fully what systems thinking is, but it's starting with the system, looking for the connection and the causal links in the system. So looking at the system as a whole, not the parts. And you can't do systems thinking by sort of trying to get all the parts in a jigsaw and think you'll create the picture. It's a completely different way of looking at how things are connected and affect each other. And this is some work we did with African scientists many years ago. And this is a picture of links and causal chains with people being laid off from work here, because here, sorry, I realise I'm pointing, you can't see it. So the truck, people are saying, I can't see any animals. And so why? Because they're being taken for bushmeat, and so there's less animals to see, and there's a grazing issue. Then we've got people saying, I'm giving up on fishing and going hunting. We've got, this was senior scientists, we now got fish speaking, I can't see to eat. Why? And the reason is because of poor farming practice at the top that's ended up with all of this sediment flowing down and affecting things. So now we've got an intervention point around the economics of the local safari lodges halfway down the Mara River, which is what this was used on. And it's all to do with sediment in the uplands, coming from the uplands. And this isn't an ecological picture, it's not an economic picture, it's not a hydrological picture, it's not a cultural picture, it's all of it, it's the system. So if we understand systems, we can start finding those crucial intervention points that catalyze systems effects. And then when you're finding solutions, you can check them back out against the SDGs, the goals, or how many of those you're hitting, and go for as many as you can. And you can try and see, are you working in the green space here, which is the safe space for human life. This is Kate Raworth's wonderful donut economics diagram.
2 minutes, Diana.
Oh my goodness, right, okay. So learn and apply collaborative systems thinking, experiment with systems pictures, just have a go. If you want to know some methods, ping me an email, I can send them. Check the SDGs and enjoy your donuts, and check that you're working in that safe space. So I'm just going to whisk now through power, barriers to power. So this diagram is some work we did with the Scottish Government about the need to share power differently. And it's at the top is responsibility for planning land or sea use, who's got that power and responsibility and who's sharing it. And then down the side, it's who's got it for delivery. And there's this matrix of different possibilities and different relationships. And in the middle, you've got co-production at the top left, or traditional service, and down in the right, self-organized planning. And different types of activity fall into these different patterns. So when we did this research, people in the various agencies in Scotland were saying, does this mean we have to empower everybody to do everything all the time in the same way? And of course, the answer is no, that different types of activity fall into different parts of this picture. So go into the one that is most empowering and most effective for others. And the benefits of doing that is you go from incremental piecemeal, you start getting the systems change through co-production, you get new understanding, new innovation, new resources and capacity to deliver, new relationships formed, new solutions that are integrated to deliver multiple benefits, shared buy-in through co-design and co-delivery, and shared enjoyment of shared benefits. So I'm going to say check out the empowerment and co-production and adopt great ethics and apply great practice. So I'm going to flip this because time's against me. I was going to ask at the end of this to what extent my rap almost of a presentation had changed your hope for the future. But I'm just going to go straight onto this, a couple more quotes and then my last slide. So hope is an embrace of the unknown and the unknowable. It's the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter and what and who it may impact are not things we can know beforehand. And that comes from Rebecca Solnit, a great historian and activist. And this one, hope is not something you have. Hope is something you create with your actions. And that comes from Alexandra Cortez, this great politician in America. So what are we doing at Dialogue Matters? Well, we're putting some events in the autumn to try and build fresh momentum. We're working with CIEEM on an event called Game Change, which is likely to be in October. We've got some great speakers lined up. It's going to be an inspiration and action planning event. We're doing an event around fresh momentum. So if you want to catalyze fresh momentum in your project or with your team, your organization, learn the skills. We've got a professionally designed pack and off you can go and do it. So it's time for a fresh approach. Be hopeful. It's about action to be hopeful. Motivate yourself, motivate others, do systems thinking, share power, take action. I'm just going to take a minute and say, just take a minute now and just write something down on a piece of paper. What will you do? Okay, that's me done. So I'm ready for questions now. I'll stop screen sharing, I guess.
You can leave. Oh, thanks, Diana. That was really good. I was getting worried because the Q&A box was empty for a while, but there's been a sudden flush of questions at the end.
Well, I'm happy not to take questions. I'm sure it'll do workshop timing a lot of good.
Well, no, we've got a few minutes. Stephanie Gresham here has asked on behalf of her 19-year-old daughter. She's been feeling down over the problems we face with pushing a green recovery. And have you any advice for a 19-year-old about to embark on a university life and who is feeling very anxious about her future in a changing world? And I guess that's sort of similar to the question of what have their ancestors done to pass on a sustainable world to their children. You know, what can they do? What can someone who's really just starting out on life?
I think it would depend on her levels of anxiety. So some people have tipped into levels of anxiety that need therapy, that need counselling and support. And if she's at that level, there are now, if you Google eco-grief counselling, there are now counsellors specialising in that. So if that's the level of anxiety that somebody is experiencing, I would understand if that was, then support is needed. If she's not at that level of distress, then I think my best advice right at the moment would be get Jonathan Porritt's book, Hope in Hell. Because yes, it talks about the reality that she's fully confronting and knowing, but it's full of hope about how we've got to work together. And then I don't know what university degree she's obviously going to do, but find purposeful action, because purposeful action really helps us manage that. And of course, get out in nature for the restorative and psychological benefits of that. So there's a few thoughts.
It's about, well, what you were saying earlier about shifting from the left-hand side of fear, uncertainty and doubt into the right-hand side, which is about hope and a more positive outlook. Yeah. I'd also suggest George Monbiot's book as well, Out of the Wreckage, which does give a lot of pointers as to what we can do to change things. And if you want inspiration, Isabella Tree's book on wilding, the story of the Neff estate in Sussex, that's very inspirational as well. A question here from Katie Metcalf. A great introduction. I was very encouraged. I'm sure you'll be pleased about this. I really like the idea of identifying systems and intervention points. How do you do this without being negative and talking about problems, or do you set a vision and then do these exercises?
Well, in terms of systems thinking, I couldn't put all the references up, but there's a great book on systems thinking, and I just got another one yesterday. Actually, I was just looking around for it. It was on my desk just now. But anyway, around systems change for climate change. But there's a great book. Email me, and there's a great book on systems thinking. There is going to be an article about this in the next edition of In Practice, and the references will be in there. But I'm happy to pass them on. So you need to understand that systems thinking is a very different way of thinking. But then when we're facilitating dialogue, we ask people to create a vision. So we ask people to imagine themselves at some suitable time in the future. Like with Marine, it could be 80 years or something like that. But imagine it used to be 2020 because that implied perfect vision. But now 2020 has not turned out to be that wonderful year that people were thinking it might be 20 years ago. But imagine some distant point away from the constraints that trap our thinking now. So it's 2040 and you're delighted with what you see and whatever the context is, and what is it you see, and people create this forward vision freed from the current constraints. And then we ask, what are you already doing that's going to get you there? How can you strengthen, enhance, amplify, accelerate that? And then we ask, what else do you need to do? And in the what else do you need to do, people put in the things that to address the gaps and the problems and the challenges. So in the positive startup of a dialogue, we don't focus on the problems and issues. Now, once people start getting to solutions, we do you know, what are the strengths of the solution, what are the challenges of the solution. But when you're scoping the context, of what's working well and what more do we need to do type questions, capture up the deficits, the gaps, but without, you know, there's a huge difference, for example, for somebody saying, there's a, you know, I suppose it was every organization, they talk about problems with IT. So, you know, there's a big difference in the statement, you know, our IT is terrible, we've got to do something about it, and say we really need to fix our IT. And just the different framing creates different forward momentum. And we've seen people in terribly difficult situations just start using different language and reframing and seeing possibilities and opening their minds to all sorts of, and motivating each other. So it's about the way you construct questions and frame things.
How important are organisations like, or groups such as Extinction Rebellion, to creating the right sort of environment for the tipping point? I mean, because their message is more sort of doom and gloom. If we don't do something, we're doomed. But does that help to create the environment where you do then get a tipping point?
Yeah, I think the climate activism and nature activism last year and the youth strikes. So, you know, my life choices have been to work at the coalface of where change happens within the system, within the sort of current way that we construct ourselves around life, and sort of to bring about change. But I absolutely support the activists outside systems, including Black Lives Matter and all these activists. I mean, there needs to be activism to shout at the system and get heard. So I think that's a different strand to bring about change, but it then catalyzes conversations. And something that can often happen, it happened to Greenpeace some decades ago around the Brent Spa, where they were sort of shouting at the system that you know, waste was wrong and oil was wrong and everything was wrong. And then they made this huge attention on the Brent Spa. I mean, it's probably too long ago for many people listening, but anyway, it was quite a moment. But then, what's the solutions then? And then Greenpeace had to, they didn't want people to know at the time, and I suppose they might now, but they had to get around the table with engineers and scientists and Shell and say, well, how do we solve this thing? So we need the two bits. We need the raising the awareness globally and internationally in all parts of society. And the youth strikes are just, I've been on them. My staff, I give my staff 3 days a year off to go and, you know, paid leave, if you like, to go and strike or do whatever. I mean, I don't know how you strike if your boss is giving you permission, but go and do it. Go and be active. That is part of it. But then once the things shifted and we've got to start looking for solutions and, you know, do something and assist in a way that's across the system and will work and bring across those sort of virtuous benefits throughout the system, then you need to start behaving in different ways. Yeah. So it's both and.
It's a process, yeah. Okay, well I think that's out of time now. Just a quick